We're going to start our next session now. Welcome back, everyone. So far, I think it's going pretty well. I would hope that you all feel the same way. And up next is Dr. Abby Gondac, and she is a wonderful, wonderful scholar. She came to us about 2 years ago as part of our Morgenthau Papers project. And I've had the pleasure of working with her and knowing her for the last 2 years. She has done an incredible amount of work in our materials. She has, in our collections and pulling together material, she has mapped things out in ways that make it so much more accessible to scholars, to teachers, to everyday folks and such. And it's my honor, my pleasure to introduce her here. She's going to be talking about some precursors and ideologies leading up to the Holocaust. And I want to say that that Abby was a driving force behind our big conference, which our little committee here kept referring to as the big conference 2 weeks ago, which was our international conference where they were looking at where a lot of this material is in archives around the world and how it can make it more accessible and such. And she just did a fantastic job with that conference. You can see some of the sessions on our website. So I'm so delighted to have her here and honored that she was able to come and talk to us. She's a former educator herself, and I know she's got some great insight for all of our teachers. So without further ado, Dr. Abby Gondac.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. And I'm going to actually share my screen. And then into the chat, I put a link to the website that I'm going to be using today for this session. So I'm hoping that you all can follow that link and be able to follow along on your own computers. And there's going to be a little bit of text study that we're going to do. So it'll be useful to have that if you're able to open that up. And if you have any issues with that, just let me know. Just want to make sure that you see what I'm seeing. So. Do you all see precursors, ideologies leading to the Holocaust?
Yes, that's almost coming, Abby.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
We see it, yeah.
So the image that I have is from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. If you go to the link that I put into the chat, you can click on all these links yourselves. But there's the US HMM has this really important collection of photographs, anti-Semitic photographs, which could help your students kind of better understand the types of, I guess you would say, kind of like Nazi propaganda and the ways that anti-Semitism were promoted in terms of visually. And so I thought this image was, especially because I'm interested in gender and sexuality as it relates to the Holocaust, I thought this was a kind of important image to start with. So this comes from the late 19th century, and basically it is making fun of a Jewish woman who is taking more than one piece of cake. So it's sort of, I would say, fat-phobic stereotypes, but also kind of stereotypes about Jews, like kind of taking more than they should and those types of things. But there's many, many images that you could look at through this link that you could potentially use in your classroom. So throughout this presentation, I have a lot of links to other resources that I'm not going to be going into depth, but you can explore more for your own classroom. So I created this text study workshop using some of the readings that I've previously used in a class I've taught called Nazism and the Holocaust. And I wanted to share with you some of the resources that I use to help my students understand the kinds of ideas that laid the foundation for what became the Holocaust, but also for other forms of genocide. So from what I've heard in the past couple of minutes, it sounds like people are already talking about these sorts of things. So sort of continuing on with that conversation. And there's a couple of questions that came from the agenda for this conference that I wanted to highlight here. So the texts that I've selected really touch upon some of these questions. So why did the Holocaust happen? What were the ideological strategies utilized in order to impact the way people thought about Jews, but also about other marginalized groups? What inhibits people's empathy and actions in response to cries for help? How does group hatred develop and what can it lead to? And what lessons from the Holocaust can students apply to their lives today? And then I also wanted to bring in the Common Core standards. I know when I was a high school teacher, I taught social studies, I taught global history, and also special education. And so we always had to tie everything back to the Common Core standards. So this exercise that I do, or that I have done with my students, it's called a critical reading analysis. And basically, I ask the students to analyze the argument or the claims, the organizational structure, and the evidence used by the authors. And so I found a Common Core standard that matches up with this type of idea, which is where you're having students evaluate authors' differing points of view on the same historical event or issue by assessing the author's claims, reasoning, and evidence. But a lot of the Common Core, I think a lot of the Common Core standards, there's more than just this one that could kind of tie in with the type of thing that I'm doing here. So now I have 3 different texts. And so what I was thinking that we could do is each of you could decide which of the texts you were most interested in focusing on. And I would give everybody a couple of minutes to read through that text. And then we could have more of a discussion about what do you think are the arguments that are being conveyed, and also how you think the author is organizing their argument and what types of evidence they're using. And so that way we could kind of divide up the readings and then all come back and be able to kind of share what we gathered. So I just want to go over with you the 3 different texts to see which one you might be the most interested in reading in more depth. So the first one is by a scholar named Amir Mufti, and it's a chapter called Jewishness as Minority. It's from a book which I've linked here in case you're interested in purchasing the book. Basically, just to give you a kind of overall premise of the book, he argues that the Jewish experience in Europe and what happened during the Holocaust, there are similarities with what occurred in India, in South Asia, with the partition between India and Pakistan. And so how the Jews have been and are treated, there's similarities with how Muslims have been treated in the Indian context. So he's kind of making these like parallels and also contemporary connections that I had heard people talking about a little bit ago. So then there's a quote from him so in a few minutes when I give you a chance, you can, if you want to focus on this one, you can focus on this particular quote, and then we'll talk about the meanings. So he's talking about a specific way that Jews are perceived and why it kind of puts them in there's like a no-win situation. And then I give you some evidence that Mufti uses. And then also we're not gonna look at this video right now, but this is something that if you're interested, you could watch this video later. I always like to include anything that's like more kind of dynamic with my students, aside from just text, because sometimes that's not the most engaging for them. The second text is about a anti-Semitic writer in France named Louis Ferdinand Céline. And it's a chapter from a book by Sandrine Sanos. The book is called The Aesthetics of Hate, Far-Right Intellectuals, Anti-Semitism and Gender in 1930s France. And I use this source because I think it really shows the kind of ideological underpinnings of anti-Semitism and that led to the Holocaust, and that it wasn't just in Germany, that in other places in Europe, these types of ideologies were very prevalent. And I also like to use it because of the way that it shows how, in this case, white Frenchmen were portraying Jews as being the oppressors or colonizers who were invading France. And so I think it could help students to understand how Nazis could have justified what they did, because they perceived it as like what I heard some people talking about before, like cleansing, in this case, France, or cleansing Germany of these invaders, these colonizers who were taking over and who were kind of abusing the white French people or the Nazi German people. So that's the second source. And then the third source that you could have the option to look at is an essay by Hannah Arendt, which is called Organized Guilt and Universal Responsibility. And this is published in her book, The Jewish Pariah, Jewish Identity and Politics in the Modern Age, which that book has many different essays by Hannah Arendt. So she was a German Jewish philosopher who immigrated to the United States. And I have a lot more like kind of links to more resources about Hannah Arendt.
Cheyenne, call me, Bobby, please.
So if you're interested, you can look at those links. So the parts that I have here are related to the idea that the people who committed these acts of violence during the Holocaust were basically doing their jobs. And so kind of elaborating on that idea of like the way that this horrendous violence could be committed by people who were just doing their kind of bureaucratic duties. So that's the third source. So I just want to make sure everybody has access to the website that I linked, which is what I'm looking at right now. Just make sure everybody has access to that. And I wanted to give you maybe like, I don't know, around 5 minutes to start, and then I can check back in and see if people need more time. But basically pick one of those three that most interest you and go to this website that I put into the chat and read that particular part. And then in about 5 or so minutes, we'll come back and you can let me know like what you thought about the arguments of that particular text, how it's organized, the evidence that's used, and keeping in mind those questions that I presented at the beginning. I'll go back to those questions. So these questions here, and then that'll help kind of guide our conversation. Oh, sure, I can resend the link. Sure, no problem. Oh yeah, for those who joined after I had posted it. Okay. And if you have any questions in those 5 minutes, I'm going to be here, so you could go ahead and ask them.
there, or there from Vispa. But Vispa
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to check in. Do you all need more time? Could you, if you would like more time, could you do like a thumbs up on under the reactions? That way I could get a sense for if people need more time or not. Okay. So since nobody said they need more time, I'm thinking that maybe you're ready. So could you all let me know how many of you focused on the first text, the one by Amir Mufti? If you could use the reactions to raise your hand, that would be helpful. So I could see.
Just in case, so everyone knows, reactions are in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. If you click that button, it gives you the chance to have multiple reactions there.
For me, it's showing, you actually have to click on the 3 dots that say more. I don't know if it's the same for everybody's. And then you go to underneath record, it says reactions, but it might look different for different people. All right, I'm not seeing any hands or anything. All right. All right, so maybe what I'll do is we could read it together and then see if anybody wants to talk about what they think the arguments are, or kind of which of the questions from the essential questions you think this connects to. So Amir Mufti wrote, "The figure of the Jew has faced a paradoxical predicament in the culture of modern West and has typically been met with a contradictory set of representational demands. On the one hand, as a figure of particularity, it has generated anxieties about the undermining of the universalizing claims and ambitions within modern culture, with the Jews coming to be seen as slavishly bound to external law and tradition, the ritual, irrational, and incapable of the maturity and autonomy called for in the development of enlightened modern subjecthood." That's one kind of set of stereotypes. On the other side is the figure of the transnational, and this raises questions about deracination, homelessness, abstraction, supranational identifications, and divided loyalties. Sort of two different portrayals of Jews that get kind of used simultaneously. Does anybody want to comment on kind of what they think this means, and kind of what maybe kind of typical anti-Semitic stereotypes you think this is touching upon?
Well, I'll make a comment. The silence is a little difficult for you, Abby, and I'm sure a lot of people have thoughts that maybe they're not expressing. And I think that the quote that you're sharing with us is written at a very high academic level. This is PhD level writing. And I'm not suggesting that the audience is incapable of comprehending that at all, but I do think that the body of students that they reach, by and large, might have a difficult time with it. So perhaps, Abby, you could lead us by articulating what you think it means and how you would relate this to a high school student. How do you make this relevant?
I can comment. I'm sorry. I can comment. I'm a high school history teacher. My name's Leah, and thank you for sharing this quote with me. And yeah, it definitely is like there's a lot to like unpack from this quote. So it does like take a hot minute. And I think some of the terms would have to be like fleshed out for high school kids. But I think it just shows that there's like multiple ways to otherize a people. And something that stands out to me is like the idea of like divided loyalties. I think that's often a way of otherizing people, saying like they're not really part of this nation state. Their loyalties are elsewhere. And that's like an easy way, especially in Nazi Germany, to say something about the Jews as like not really being part of the nation state. And if you contextualize this at a time when nationalism was like such a dominant ideology and fervor, to suggest that Jews had loyalties elsewhere. I think that was like a really, that probably resonated with a lot of people who were anti-Semitic, and kind of, it not only played on their anti-Semitism, but probably also played on their identity as Germans. So that's something maybe I could take away from it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. That they are like this part, like the particular, like that basically is referring to the idea that they're too sort of like exclusive to themselves, and they're kind of too focused on their own community, and they're not part of like the general like kind of national culture, and they're too focused on like this part, their own tradition, their own rituals, and that they're irrational. So they're incapable of like kind of reaching the heights of being sort of enlightened citizens. And then on the other hand, the other side of that is that Jews are portrayed as being like the wandering Jew stereotype. So they are without a race, they're homeless, they're difficult to place. So this basically, what you were saying is very, very accurate. So I like to use complex text because it gets students to really dig into the text and break it apart into pieces and try to figure out like, okay, what do these words mean? And but there's definitely resources that are this sort of idea. Actually, towards the end of this particular webpage, I've got some additional resources under one of the close to the end sections. And so like this fact sheet on identifying anti-Semitic narratives, this includes information related to the stereotype that I was just talking about. But there's some other good resources here as well. So the
Abby, can I ask a question? Yeah. Did anybody ever?
Sure.
I mean, just the fact that paragraph, long as it is, it seems to really be pointing in two different directions. I mean, it's on the one hand, they're too inclusive. On the other hand, they're not. They're the wandering Jew stereotype. So to me, just as a critical thinker, it's almost like he's trying to address both sides of this stereotype, which leads me to believe that neither one is actually accurate. And again, the truth is somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, did anybody
well,
ever
it's kind of like,
students...
yeah, exactly, Jeff. It's the way that's also often happens with marginalized groups, where they get stereotyped in these very like opposite ways. It's like when you put them together, it doesn't really make sense because,
right.
Yeah, you're saying they're completely like this, but then they're also completely like that. And so yeah, I think that is a very prevalent way of stereotyping people. So it's like they can't win,
Right.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of that, if you like really break down the text, she talks about like they're incapable of autonomy, yet they also have supranational national identifications. I feel like that's contradictory too. It's like, are these autonomous people, are they incapable? Are they capable of their own autonomy, but like elsewhere? So yeah, that's definitely two ways of looking at them, and therefore they're both not true. And just at the end of the day, like supranational, like they're not part of our nation. That's kind of like the overriding sentiment. Mm-hmm. And that was like the main drive here. It's to denationalize them from the German concept of nationhood.
The other thing I find interesting is, you could attach these same stereotypes to almost anybody. I mean, you could say that about football people. People, there's certain football teams they love, or certain, it just is so wrong,
I want to echo what you just said, Jeffrey, because I think that you had a very important point, and a way for teachers to perhaps turn this narrative around. In a way, this is stereotyping is also an opportunity in a positive sense to rejoice in diversity, to celebrate differences, and to see how here we were vilifying their uniqueness. And maybe in some ways, when I grew up, it was the melting pot story that we're all going to come together and be one American, one America. But what we're doing today, I think they can empathize with, is we want to celebrate the Hispanic identity, the African American identity, and other the Native Indian identity, and that rather than sort of isolating them because they're different and seeing that as a threat to society, we can talk about as students, and teachers can talk about as students, the wonderful things that each of these cultures bring to a society. And then you create an opportunity for individual students to speak up as who they are, I'm a this, and we do this, and that's very strange in our household. That's very unique in our culture. You could see us as being different. You could see us as being a threat, or you can say, wow, that's really cool. I think it's a great, isn't that an opportunity for interaction on the part of students?
Yes, definitely. I think it is. And I was wondering if I wanted to move down to the very last text, because I think it's a different kind of perspective and topic, which is this idea that, so there's this conversation that's happening between kind of a Nazi criminal who was on trial, and the kind of questions that would be asked and the responses, and kind of how somebody could go about doing this and not take responsibility for what they did. So the question is posed, did you kill people in the camp? Yes. Did you poison them? Did you bury them alive? Yes, it sometimes happens. Did you personally help kill people? Absolutely not. I was only a paymaster in the camp. What did you think of what was going on? It was bad at first, but we got used to it. Do you know the Russians will hang you? In other words, being tried for these war crimes. And then the response is, why would they, or why should they? What have I done? And then Hannah Arendt says he had only carried out orders, and since when has it been a crime to carry out orders? So I think this type of thing could be really powerful to use with students, because instead of portraying Nazis as being sort of these evil, demonic, kind of serial killer type of people, that it could actually have been normal people who could have participated in these horrendous acts. So I was wondering what kind of your thoughts were on this type of idea, and how you think maybe students would, like, their responses to these types of, this type of a source.
I think that the questions they're seeing that, I think it's very powerful because, it's true what he was a soldier, or he was in this camp, he had to do what he had to do to survive, right? And a lot of, especially when kids are learning about the Holocaust for the first time, they're like, I don't understand why people became Nazis. I don't understand how they didn't realize this was wrong. And, I try to express them that some people did things just to survive themselves and to protect themselves and their family. And so this guy, whether he believed in what he was doing or wasn't doing, it's what he was told to do. He had to survive just like everybody else. So I think it brings up a lot of room for discussion and students to kind of think about, what would I do if I was in this situation? Would I be an upstander? Would I stand out? Or would I just comply because I have to think about myself and other people? And just to go back to the beginning, Abby, with the complexity of the text, when we think about skills and getting kids ready for regents exams and stuff like that, you have to teach them how to break down those more complex things, because they don't have the skills. They're used to us just kind of telling them what to think, right? So I like that the text is complex because it opens up room for conversation. How would I approach this and how would I break it down? And then they can think about, well, how do I think and how do I feel about this? So I think it's good.
Yeah, I think what I would teach my students would be like, okay, what words in this text do you understand what they mean? Like, or what terms from this text are kind of coming out at you? Like the word particular, or the word like tradition or ritual, and then like kind of use that as a stepping stone to accessing the other words in the text that you might not understand, and how to look up the definitions. And so I think, and also like this particular one that I'm showing right now, I think it's good because it's a dialogue, so that might be easier for students to kind of get the idea of it. And also I've included some, I included a video interview with Hannah Arendt, and there's also, I have a link here to her very infamous writing called Eichmann in Jerusalem. And so her views about this were very controversial at the time. And maybe still today, there's people who like disagree with her arguments. But that's another thing that I like to bring to students is like, you don't have to agree with any of these authors. It's more like a conversation for like, what do you think about what they're presenting? And do you think that their arguments are like, do they support them with evidence? Is their evidence strong enough to support what they're arguing? So kind of getting the critical thinking going.
The critical thinking I think is wonderful there, because, again, you really got to do that, because, this idea of breaking down this horrific overarching event into bite-sized pieces so that nobody feels, I'm just, what do you do? Oh, I'm just the policeman. I just arrest people that are on this list. And then what happens to them? Well, I turn them over to the truck driver. Well, what is truck driver? Well, I just drive people from point A to point B. And it's not, unless you're critically thinking of, what happens to these people ultimately? The Nazis were very clever that way. They were able to break it down into, I'm just doing my job. I'm the cop. I arrest guys. I'm a truck driver. I drive trucks. I'm the whoever. And, without that lack of critical thinking, without that lack of being able to speak truth to authority, to say, what's the bigger picture here? What are we doing with this? You really are at the, you're in the mix, and there's no way out.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, because if nobody takes, like, if it's like everybody has responsibility, but then nobody has responsibility. which is what something that Hannah Arendt really focused on, like the way that the Nazis made it so that everybody was somehow involved. So then the true kind of masterminds behind it couldn't be effectively prosecuted because everybody had been forced to participate or had somehow become, involved in the killing machine, basically. So I think it's like the bystander effect. I don't know if you all have taught your students about this, but like when something bad is happening, somebody's being hurt in the street, or so everybody thinks that somebody else is going to do something, but then nobody else does anything because everybody thinks somebody else is going to do something. So I think that really came into play in this particular situation as well.
It also goes back to your first piece of information there, with this idea of the stereotype pushing in two opposite directions. It's the same thing here. It's like either everybody was involved or nobody was involved. And what is the truth? The truth is everybody had some culpability in it. Whether you recognized it or not, whether you realized it or not, whether you liked it or not, that was part of the mix.
I think this also brings up like the question of like, when you talk about culpability, how do you ever seek at an international court level any sort of justice? Because it's never, if 12 million people die, obviously that's got to be at the hands of thousands of perpetrators. And, is there ever any sense of justice at the end of this when only a handful actually go on trial? Because clearly there's culpability in the hands of the guy driving the train, the guy running the train station. They knew they were part of a mechanism that was leading to something bad, but they participated, and there is culpability there, even if it was a choiceless choice to some degree. So, yeah, and it definitely brings up like this whole idea of like, first they came for the socialists, but I wasn't a socialist, so I didn't do anything. And we study these things in like it does loop back in ways to like human nature too. Like, at what point are you surviving? But at what point are you also just being complicit in a larger mechanism that is totally destructive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
I was going to say, Abby, what's common in this conference, whether you're talking about what Paula and Dave said, some of Laura's comments, obviously Jeffrey's content, is this theme of how do teachers work with this? Okay, not what we think were the causes of the Holocaust, not what we personally feel about society today in a sense, but as teachers, how do we do the Lador Vador concept that this conference is about, and what tools are we using? So you're giving us a tool, Jeffrey's giving us a tool, 3G gave us a tool. I'm curious if teachers in the audience, if they have examples of tools that they've used or ways that they approach this subject in order to create that critical thinking that Laura and Jeffrey have spoken about. What is there anybody that has a resource? Or, I mean, we've provided you a lot of resources too. It's really about how do we not what was the Holocaust about, but how do you teach the Holocaust?
Right, and that's a great point, Jonah, because one of the things I was going to ask folks is, one of the themes of this conference is community. So I would love if you folks have got ideas on resources that you've used that have worked particularly well that you'd like to share with other teachers. If you could send those to me in an email, I'll make sure that we add those to our resource list, and we can build our community resource list that way. Because again, some of the stuff will work for some people, some of it won't work for others, some of it will work for some classes, some of it won't work for other classes. And the more tools we have in our toolbox, the more able and complete we're going to be able to get the job done. So thank you so much, Abby, for sharing that with us. And again, the work that Abby's done here, in terms of going through this material has just been Herculean over the last 2 years. And I want to thank her for being a part of this.